it's interesting. Previously, and this is why I say I think there always will be an annual pass holder system of some kind, because when the spring hits and the people who would descend on your park during the peak times go away, who's going to be filling up the park? Well, you're going to be looking at annual pass holders. It's interesting about that conversation because Tokyo just debuted an annual pass holder system for the first time since reopening, since they reopened from closing because of the pandemic, right? And it is so convoluted. Like you can, it's like you buy in, like I think it's like a 300 yen pass or something. Don't quote me on the particulars, but I'm going to tell you just kind of give you an idea. And it's only good for the next 3 months. And you can only get 6 days.
Okay.
And you can't have more than 4 days per month. And you have to go in through via a lottery. And it's all this stuff, right? That just makes it super convoluted because, it's Tokyo. They were only letting people in like only 5,000 people at a time in some of these parks. Like during big, like for 2 years they did that, right? It was crazy. So their capacity constraints and how they're dealing with it is a lot different than what we're dealing with here. And you could always kind of look at that system and go, wow, as bad as the Magic Key system might be or might be perceived as being, that's a crappy deal, and it can always get worse.
Right, exactly. Well, and the interesting thing about what Tokyo does is because Tokyo really isn't, well, it isn't run by Disney per se. It's run by the OLC company or Oriental Land Company, and then they just kind of license out the Disney brand.
Yes.
So it's kind of like this independently run entity. What's interesting about that is that with the Oriental Land Company and these kind of changes to their pass system, which are much worse, I will say, than the domestic parks, but still in the same vein as the domestic parks, where they're adding a lot more restrictions to that program. And it makes me think there must be something in the internals from OLC and from the domestic parks showing that this restriction is necessary. Because if it was just, look, a lot of people just like to say, oh, it's Chapek, oh, it's tomorrow. But if it was really just Chapek and tomorrow, and they're just greedy guys or whatever, well, it doesn't really explain then why OLC is implementing even harsher restrictions. They're not known to have that reputation. So there must be something in what they're seeing internally that's causing them to kind of sit up and take notice and say, hey, we have to really limit the amount of these pass holders for whatever reason, whatever justification that is. I don't know, but there must be some real legitimate business purpose for it.
I think there is. So in the case of, I want to get these details correct for you guys on screen. So I looked it up. I didn't know I was going to be talking about this necessarily, but I think it's a very interesting conversation. Yeah. So it's worth going through. So the multi-visit passport is what they're calling it. Will be valid from May 1st through July 31st and cost 44,000 yen, which is about $381. Right. Okay. The pass is valid for exactly six visits, 2 per month, subject to very restricted blackout dates. Guests must enter a lottery system during the first week of the month before their visit, similar to the previous annual passport lottery when the parks first reopened. So that's interesting. Yeah. For example, so those who wish to visit in May will be required to apply for 2 dates between April 1st and 7th. It's a very restrictive system. And I think the same things plague Tokyo that they do here. And that is capacity, but capacity based on staff. Not all facilities are open on either coast, whether it be at Disneyland or Walt Disney World. And surely not everything is open at Tokyo Disneyland when they can only let in like 5,000 or 10,000 people per day, right? You had to make sacrifices. You had to make cuts. You had to do things to keep these places operational, but also profitable. When it comes to us here in the States, I've heard a lot of talk about operators in Walt Disney World and how it's like we just do not have the staff available to take off the reservation system. It's just they just don't exist. And we're having problems getting people in. It is interesting though, because I have heard that operators in Walt Disney World are kind of like they're kind of mixed on the idea. For example, Epcot operators aren't really a fan of the reservation system, and particularly people who put on the festivals aren't really a fan of the reservation system. Why? Because those festivals are predicated, are mostly used by or that revenue is generated by APs who go spontaneously, who just say, you know what, I want to see Flower and Garden, or I want to see Food and Wine Festival, right? And they just spontaneously go in. But there's an impediment there with this reservation system.
Right.
If people can't get a reservation, they can't get in, they can't spend money, they can't, do these things, right? But whereas like Disney's Hollywood Studios, for example, those theme park operators are like, we need the reservation system because if we didn't have one, the line for Rise would be back to the park entry, right? We had to limit how many people actually walk in the door here. So there have been kind of different schools of thought. I've actually heard that maybe as an attempt to kind of wean themselves off of this, because there are upsides, but there are downsides to it. Maybe having select times during the summer at Epcot be open to a point where you don't have to have a reservation at all.
Wow.
And then maybe the weekends you do, and maybe that's different for ticket holders than it is for annual pass holders and so forth, right? I could start to see that, but while this reservation system is in effect, whether it be operational demands or whatever, I think we're going to see these kind of patterns emerging, and maybe Disney getting more data as far as the buckets and that dividing is concerned.
It's fascinating, and I'm not as familiar with Walt Disney World, but for Disneyland, I feel like the reservation system is more draconian than it is in Florida. I feel like it's a harder get. I think there's more fight to get your spot sort of thing than there is in Florida, which is interesting to me because we're more of a locals market, but so is Tokyo. Yes. Which plays into this. Tokyo is a very locals driven resort as well. Maybe even more so, I would even argue maybe even more so than Disneyland Resort. They probably even receive less tourism than Anaheim.
I think that would be accurate because of population density.
Yeah.
Because Japan, Tokyo, that's way different than Southern California in terms of population density. So yeah, I would agree with you. And it's interesting how these systems bear out, like for example, Genie Plus, right? Genie Plus is going to play a lot differently in Orlando than it is in California, right? Because California is such a locals-driven market, then maybe you don't have as much Genie Plus adoption that you do in Florida, where people are paying thousands of dollars just to be, at the parks, right? Just to be there. So it's like, okay, well, I had to take advantage of some of these systems in order to get my money's worth, right?
Right.
So that's a different mindset and philosophy. Well, the same thing applies here, but for different reasons, right? Orlando's not really a big AP resort, whereas Disneyland and, like you said, Tokyo are very much annual pass holder driven, and how you how you play with these reservation systems has a dramatic effect on the level of access from these individuals and so forth. So I think it's a particular interesting point.